Emotion, feel, if you will, is one of the three elements that I consider to be the most important parts of being a blues guitar player. And you can apply these to other genres as well, but blues is probably what got me into the guitar. Jimi Hendrix was my guitar hero, and Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck. A lot of these guys are rooted in the blues, and as a result have had a big influence in my playing. So I'm going to talk to you kind of about the styles that I've picked up and what goes into these three elements. And I'm going to tell you about the first element now, which is vocabulary. So possessing a strong vocabulary obviously comes with hours upon hours of listening to blues guitar players who came before us and understanding some of the staple licks that everybody knows more or less, but that you turn into your own. So there's this basic lick like this. Everybody knows that, right? But there's a million different varieties of that lick and different ways to play it. But the foundation comes back to having the vocabulary, understanding that lick exists and having it in your arsenal in its most basic form. And then when you have that basic form, you can manipulate it. Moving on with more vocabulary that I think you should know. In general, bending is the most important part of guitar playing, but especially when it comes to the blues, you want to be able to express that pain and anguish that resides inside you. So the perfect bend will have a bit of vibrato at the end of it. So how I practice bending is I take a note, then I'll move down a half step or a whole step and bend up to that note as best I can. And then I'll add vibrato once I've got that bend to a place where I think is perfect. So as you can see, I have the claw grip going on here. I've gone over this a couple times. This is kind of the Hendrix, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Paul Gilbert. Everybody has this type of grip when it comes to bending because it is the most strong way to grip the guitar, and it will provide you with the most leverage to make even the most extreme bends with ease. So I ended that phrase with the next piece of vocabulary that I think is important. It's this bend from nowhere, where you will bend up and then grab the string adjacent to the one that you're actually bending, but don't hit it until the top of the bend, and you'll come down on that string. So it's a bend from nowhere, kind of just a bend out of nowhere. So instead of, it's just, and paired with the initial bend, it sounds like this. So if you pay attention to my right hand, you'll see it's not only keeping the strings from ringing out, so I avoid something like this, but it's also kind of being acrobatic to ensure that I don't hit both strings at once to yield something like this. And I'm adding a little rake to get a little bit more accentuation on this effect. And you'll probably recognize this from like the Hotel California solo, for example. Jimi Hendrix was also a huge advocate of this technique. He would do it with a little bit more swagger though, something like this. So like I said, understanding how to play the technique in its most basic form and then adding your own spice to it, whether it's the quick kind of Hotel California style or the Hendrixy style or something of your own. Another really important part about vocabulary is understanding note selection, so what each note does to the chord that you're playing. Obviously, I'm taking a 12-bar blues approach, which is just a 1, 4, 5. So it's a really simple way to start when you have this one chord, just to bend each note or play each interval of this minor scale, which would be something like this. And then you can play each interval. And understand what it does over that chord. And you can do that with a loop pedal or just kind of work on your ear training to hear those intervals and how they interact. Understanding the note selections in these intervals is what helps you break out of, traditional licks like these and find something a little bit more expressive. Now, obviously, I could go on for hours talking about all the different vocabulary that I think is important when it comes to blues, but those are the essentials. Bending in tune and having a couple bendy type licks that also rely on your personal preference when it comes to note selection. I preach in a lot of my lessons that an understanding of intervals is exactly what you need in order to kind of break out of the boxes. When I get questions about how do I break out of this box, or how do I break out of the same licks over and over playing them, I say understand intervals and you will find new flavors to taste when it comes to these licks. So if you want to learn more about intervals and how scales work and how the different intervals will interact with different chords, then check out Guitar Super System, which is linked down in the description. Let's move on to the next essential part of blues guitar, which is technique. Now, I already kind of lumped bending into the vocabulary side of things just because it's so important. I'm going to mention it one more time. Bending in tune. It's very important for anything. You have to bend in tune or else you can play the flashiest thing ever, and then if you end on a, it's not going to be awesome. So we'll move on to raking, which is a pretty straightforward technique. It's essentially having your right hand and left hand working together to mute the notes that you don't want to ring out in order to achieve a bit more aggressive attack of a given note. So the 11th fret of the B string, I'm going to mute every string except that B string, right? So my right hand is taking care of those bottom 4 strings, and then my ring finger here is covering that E string. So I can play all 6 strings and only hear that one note. And when you're raking, especially down here near the bottom, you don't have to rake all 6 strings. I usually kind of stay in a 2 to 3 string radius. And when you pair that with bending, you can hear that kind of Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. So I'm actually doing an up rake and then a down rake to get the most extreme. And then you can do whatever you want with it. Another really important technique is double stop. So I was throwing them in there a little bit. Essentially, it's just when 2 notes are ringing simultaneously. So instead of playing a single note lick like this, you could play something like this. And you can also skip strings, and I like to do this with my fingers. This is another important technique to be able to do, is use your pick and your fingers, or just fingers or just pick. You should be versatile no matter what genre you play, in my opinion. So instead of a lick like this, I'll play the same thing, but I'll bar my hand, and every time I attack with my thumb, I'll also attack with my index finger on this barred note, which is the 8th fret of the E string. gives you that really cool kind of like ZZ Top thing. So it's a nice little way to get more out of that pentatonic shape that you might be used to. So that brings us to the last element of blues guitar playing that I think is essential, and that is feel. I mentioned it in the beginning of the video. It's the attitude that you play with. It's what makes you have your own voice on the guitar. Any life experiences you've had, that's where the blues comes from. Blues means not necessarily sadness, but emotion. It's what helps you relieve the stress of whatever burdens you are carrying. We all have them. So understanding the attitude is really something that I can't show you how to do. It's just kind of like you close your eyes and you take, like I mentioned, the vocabulary and the technique side of things, and you just let that happen. Let it come out through whatever you're feeling. And I know it sounds kind of weird and silly to say, just close your eyes and let it happen, man. But it really, that's the best way I can describe it. And you'll see with your favorite guitar players, everybody kind of gets into their own zone, and you don't have to make faces if you don't want to, but I tend to make some pretty crazy faces when I get into that zone. So I hope that this lesson has helped you kind of define what it is to be a blues player and help you find your own sound, because I know that a lot of people learn with the minor pentatonic scale and then they're like, what do I do now? Well, hopefully this has cleared things up for you. Learn vocabulary by listening to a lot of great guitar players and messing around with those licks, forming them into a style that you prefer, and then hone your technique. Work on the bends, work on the vibrato, work on the double stops and the note selection. Have all of that grouped into a cluster that is always in the back of your head. And then when it's time to play, rely on your feel and your attitude. Whatever you're feeling inside, try and get it to come out on the fretboard. Until next time, guys, keep shredding.